They say time gets easier, and sometimes it doesn't. Even to this day, 24 years later, it still seems like it was yesterday.
There's no way to describe the pain that a mother can feel. There's just no way.
The victim's neck was sliced almost to the point of being decapitated.
We learned that the night that she disappeared, there was a big fight.
Witnesses told us they could hear banging around in the apartment upstairs.
They just kept making me repeat my story. And they were like, so you're angry? They're like, you have a bad temper? And I'm like, yes, yes. And I'm like, but I did not kill her.
It was a very volatile situation.
There was information that was developed that then led us more to look at this married couple.
There always seemed to be an argument about this one person.
It was ruining his marriage and his life.
And the question was, well, was she just a witness or did she help? He made allegations that she offered him money and sex to kill him. This was a love triangle with a fatal ending.
In the early afternoon of June 15, 2000, a 911 call comes in from the National Canal Museum in Easton, Pennsylvania.
We have a canal in Easton, and there is a museum there on the property, but it also has a parking area. People can go down there. It's a recreational site. It's frequented by citizens in the Easton area. There were Canal Museum employees, security-type folks for the area, that saw these girls in the parking lot who were hysterical and were screaming. There was a suspected death, so law enforcement was contacted.
I was working the day shift with another detective, and we got called to the scene. My lieutenant, Lieutenant Parkansky, also responded.
Upon arriving at the scene, detectives learned Michelle Hetzel and Carrie Renner found the victim, who they identify as 19-year-old Devin Guzman.
We arrived there, Michelle and Carrie are there, crying. They're sitting on a stone wall, pointing to Devin's car. It was a silver Pontiac.
When we looked in the car, we saw a young female with a jacket covered over her.
Devin Guzman was sort of in a fetal type position, curled up on the seat. She had a syringe on her nearby.
The syringe was tucked in her waistband.
They determined that Devin Guzman is deceased because the syringe was there. There was a thought that she may have committed suicide or there was some kind of drug overdose.
Detectives learn Carrie Renner is Devin's roommate and girlfriend. She and Michelle had reported Devin missing earlier that morning.
Carrie goes on to tell us exactly, what happened.
The night before, Devin and I were fighting. We were throwing things around the apartment. It was just getting heated. So Devin left to go down to Michelle's house.
According to Carrie, Devin was going to Michelle Hetzel's residence. They were friends, but then Hetzel contacts Carrie Renner and says, Devin didn't show up, where is she?
So there was an alert put out to our police department and the other police departments.
Michelle and Carrie. They also called the 911 center several times to follow up. They were very concerned about her. They started driving around looking for her. Eventually, they go to the Canal Museum. Apparently, that's a place that was important to Devin, so they decided that, maybe she went there to go for a walk.
So we pulled in. Devin's car was there. I walked up to the car, and I looked in, and I didn't see her. So I'm like, Michelle, she's not here. And, Michelle kind of gasped, put her hand over her mouth, and she's like, what do you mean she's not there? Which prompted me to look again. And I'm like, oh, she's sleeping in the back seat. So for some reason, I had Devin's keys. Devin had mine. I unlocked the door. I noticed that her lips and her eyebrows were purple. So I reached and I grabbed onto her jacket and I shook her and I said, baby, are you okay? She didn't respond, so I yelled for Michelle to come so we could take her to the hospital. At that time, there was a city worker nearby, and he heard what was going on, and he suggested to have the police come. So the police show up, the ambulance is there. Finally, one of the medics just looks over and shouts that she's dead.
I had known Devin's father from high school. To tell her parents and her family, it was heartbreaking.
Around 1 in the afternoon, I got a phone call saying that they found her in the back of her car and she wasn't with us anymore. There's no way to describe the pain that a mother can feel. There's just no way.
Born in 1981, Devin Guzman grew up in a tight-knit family in Easton, Pennsylvania.
Devin, growing up, she was a tomboy. Devin always was a lot of fun. The life of the party, you know.
Devin's personality was very bubbly, always happy. She was always very lively and on the go.
As a teenager, Devin became fast friends with Carrie Renner and Michelle Hetzel.
When I first came to Easton in 91, I met Michelle at the bus stop, and we instantly became friends. Then I first met Devin through Michelle. I was a year older than them, so I was the only one that was driving at the time. Devin was carefree. You know, she had a big heart. She had a wild imagination. Everybody that she came in contact with loved her.
She was just a normal high school girl. Went to school, again, still liked the roller skating. Hanging with her cousins, going to the football games.
We just continued to hang out until our friendship, evolved into a relationship for the both of us. Well, coming public, it was 1996, and it was not acceptable. We were often judged, where we went. Devin's mom always accepted us.
It didn't matter to me. I mean, if that's who she was and that's what she wanted out of her life, then I loved her anyway. It didn't matter. And she knew that.
Devin and Carrie seemed happy. They never stayed home. They were always out. Go to the park, go for hikes, take drives, whatever they wanted to do.
After high school, Carrie asked Devin to move in with her.
She just wanted to settle down, and she was excited when she finally did get her own place with Carrie. Devin and Carrie also briefly talked a little bit about moving to Arizona.
She has family there. But, we were young, so we didn't have money. So she had applied for a Sunoco gas card. And so we were waiting for that to come in the mail.
Wherever life was going to take her, she was going. That was Devin.
Now, at only 19 years old, Devin Guzman's body has been found in the backseat of her own car by her girlfriend.
So first we photographed the scene to make sure we have an accurate representation of what we see when we arrived. And then once we started to move her, we observed a large laceration on her throat.
The victim's neck was sliced almost to the point of being decapitated,
which then immediately suggested that this was a homicide.
There was a small knife that was in her hand.
But that knife was too small to commit those injuries. And it was obviously not possible. She slit her throat herself. Due to the severity of the laceration, you would have expected to see a tremendous amount of blood in the car, and there was very minimal amount of blood in the vehicle.
That car would have been covered with blood, but there was very little blood under her.
So we know immediately that she was killed somewhere else and then brought to the Canal Museum. Someone tried to stage the body to make it look like a suicide.
Someone was trying to lead law enforcement or investigators to believe that this was a self-inflicted wound, but it was amateurish. It appears that the people that were staging this didn't really know what they were doing.
Well, we're kind of looking at Michelle and Carrie because they report her missing. They find her. Carrie's the last one to see her. We know that with them finding her and it being staged, that there's a possibility that one or both of them are involved in the murder of Devin.
Coming up, detectives uncover complex dynamics in Devin's love life.
They are still actively involved in some kind of a sexual relationship. She starts to point out instances where she would get very, very jealous and very upset.
She would always cause a ruckus and chaos.
She had had a fight, a pretty violent fight with Devin that night before she went missing.
Hours after 19-year-old Devin Guzman was found murdered in the back of her car, detectives asked Devin's girlfriend, Carrie Renner, and close friend, Michelle Hetzel, to make a formal statement.
We were very aware early in this investigation that this was a state scene. Someone wanted to make it look like a suicide.
So the girls are at the scene. They're the ones that have found Devin. So it's imperative that we get a statement from them.
Carrie and Michelle went back to the police station. They were interviewed.
Detectives begin their line of questioning with Devin's friend, Michelle.
We start to ask her about the relationship that she has with Devin. We find out Michelle and Devin knew each other from school.
Michelle presented herself as sort of a meek and mild young girl, and her statement to the police is that, Devin, they're friends, they'd had a relationship.
She said, and then at one point, they were lovers in high school.
What we learned was that Devin had a sexual relationship with Carrie, and Devin also had a sexual relationship with Michelle. Michelle acknowledged that the sexual relationship was over, that she's with her husband now, she's happy with her husband.
After high school, at some point, Michelle met Brandon Bloss, and then they got married.
Michelle was 18 when they got married, and Brandon was 5 or 6 years older than Michelle.
After learning she and Devin were once lovers, detectives asked Michelle if that caused any known issues in Carrie and Devin's relationship.
Michelle said Carrie would get very, very jealous and very upset. And she starts to point out instances where Carrie and Devin had domestic arguments.
She said Carrie was jealous very much of Devin's and Michelle's relationship because they were still friends.
Down the hall, detectives confront Carrie about her relationship with Devin.
We learned that the night that she disappeared, there was a big fight between Carrie and Devin.
Devin came home from her father's house and she was wasted. She lied about Michelle being there at her dad's house. And I was really angry. She was really trying to calm me down. But then Michelle started paging her. She wanted to hang out. So Michelle was persistent and she kept paging her and kept paging her. Devin and I kept fighting. Devin was pretty irate at this time. Devin wanted to drive down to Michelle's house. I told her that this makes zero sense. You're drunk, you're gonna kill yourself. If you're going to Michelle's, then I'll drive. It was pretty silent on the ride to Michelle's house because I was beyond being mad and disappointed and angry at Devin. So we get to Michelle's house and I wait in the car and Devin goes over and knocks on the door, and it took Brendan maybe a minute or so to answer the door. He saw me in the car and he said that Michelle doesn't want me around, take me home, that she didn't want me there. So Devin was pretty mad. She came back to the car. She punched the hood of the roof while she walked by and she got in the car. The ride home, we had started talking and she did say that she was gonna go back, and I still was not happy about that. We get back to the apartment. She wanted to walk me up the stairs. She went to give me a kiss, so I turned my head because I was mad. And so she kissed my cheek, and I said, she told me she loved me. And I was like, whatever. And then I walked up the stairs. So Devin left to go down to Michelle's house, and I went inside and I went to sleep. I woke up to Michelle paging me. It was probably about like midnight now, 12:30. And she kept paging me and paging me and paging me and calling. So I finally answer the phone, and she accuses me of keeping Devin against her will. She's saying that Devin never showed up. I'm like, Devin's not here. And so she shows up. She shows up probably around like 2 o'clock or something like that. Michelle sees that Devin's not there, and like she's paranoid and she's worried, and she wants me to report her missing.
Carrie did not initially want to call the 911 center. She tells us that Michelle's the one that's insistent about calling and reporting the missing person.
So finally, around, I don't know, maybe 3 in the morning, I gave in and I called the police.
Michelle Hetzel says maybe we ought to call the police and report her a missing person. And I think Carrie's reluctant to do that. So that was suspicious. That's why Carrie was a focus of the investigation.
But Carrie claimed she had nothing to do with it.
Detectives circled back to Michelle Hetzel, who reiterates her concerns about the last time she saw Devin and Carrie.
Michelle Hetzel is trying to imply in her statement that, there was a fight between Devin and Carrie and maybe she got hurt there, but she maintains that she never showed back up at her home again.
I didn't know at that time, but Michelle was basically pinning it on me.
Detectives in Easton, Pennsylvania are beginning to suspect that Devin Guzman's volatile relationship with Carrie Renner may have been the catalyst for Devin's murder.
Carrie acknowledged that she had had a fight, a pretty violent fight with Devin that night before she went missing. And so because of that, we look at her as a potential suspect.
But as her interview with police continues, Carrie shares a detail about the fight that Michelle Hetzel failed to mention.
Carrie does tell us that Michelle and Devin are still actively involved in some kind of a sexual relationship, which contradicts what Michelle told us.
Devin and I were together and we were doing great. And Michelle would just always try to interfere.
Devin was living with Carrie, but then would go meet Michelle, and that would obviously start an argument.
Devin would be sorry, and she would come home, and then, eventually things would be fine with us.
Carrie tells us that Michelle is a very jealous person regarding Devin, that even though she's married to Brandon, that, she's fiercely protective of Devin and believes that those two are going to be together forever.
Carrie tells detectives that Devin and Michelle had recently taken a romantic vacation together.
We find out that Devin and Michelle had gone to the Virgin Islands. The trip to the Virgin Islands occurred shortly before the murder.
I do remember Devin calling me once from the islands, and I was not pleased. I was irate. I was told that they exchanged rings. I think it was kind of just, teenagers saying, I vow to, be with you kind of thing.
Carrie was very upset about that. She thought that Devin was going to be exclusive with her, so she was very upset about that this relationship was occurring.
She came home. I'm not sure how things got back to good, but I just saw a change in Devin, that she was ready to stop this teenage drama of a relationship. So she felt the only way to do that was for us to get out of Easton. So we were gonna head to Mesa, Arizona, and I believe that Devin was just doing the right thing. She really wanted to grow.
Following their interviews, detectives released both Michelle and Carrie.
There was no arrest. They came in voluntarily. They're free to go.
They both denied being involved in the murder.
I mean, law enforcement, this is not unusual. We start hearing different stories. We have to start to compare notes and find out who's telling the truth.
After the interviews, we're kind of looking at Carrie. She's still a suspect at that point. Carrie's the last one to see her. Carrie is there when we find her. They had a fight just before Devin left, so we applied for a search warrant.
Within hours, detectives conduct the search of Devin and Carrie's apartment.
Inside, it looked like there were obvious signs of some kind of confrontation or disturbance. Furniture that had been tossed. It just looked like there was some kind of fight there. During the execution of that search warrant, we locate a car mat in the shower, which would probably indicate that somebody was trying to wash something off that.
That's when it gets into the use of luminol. Luminol is a chemical that reacts to any type of blood.
And we found some blood residue on that car mat.
Well, at that time we're thinking Carrie must have dropped some blood on the car mat while she was staging her body in the back of her car.
This might be evidence that Devin Guzman was murdered here. The blood goes to the lab, and we have to wait till we get the result to find out what's going on. But that was one of the reasons why we were looking at Carrie early on.
With physical evidence secured, detectives begin canvassing the neighborhood.
She and Devin lived over top of a bar, and we ended up talking to the bartender and some other patrons who told us that the night of the murder, they could hear banging around in the apartment upstairs where Devin and Carrie lived.
So because of that, we look at her as maybe she did harm later to Devin.
When detectives return to the station, they discover prior reports connected to the couple's relationship.
She and Devin lived in Forks Township. There were several police calls to the Forks Township Police Department where they would have sometimes violent, physical domestics. Their relationship was very volatile.
We're not solely focused on Carrie, but Carrie is, in my opinion, she was the primary suspect at that time.
Authorities in Easton, Pennsylvania have zeroed in on Carrie Renner as the primary suspect in her girlfriend Devin Guzman's murder. On June 17, 2000, detectives bring Carrie back to the station to confront her with the evidence.
It was 2 days after she died, and it just went on and on for what seemed like the entire day. They just kept making me repeat my story. And I kept saying it. I kept saying the same thing. And they're like, so you're angry. They're like, you have a bad temper. And I'm like, yes. And I'm like, but I did not kill her. So it's quite terrifying. Finally, I stand up and I'm like, are you going to arrest me or can I leave? And so they say, well, you could have left hours ago. So I left.
Even though we didn't find anything conclusive, we requested that Carrie take a polygraph exam, and she did several days later.
She passed, and focus then went away from her pretty much.
The night before we buried Devin, my son Derek and I, when we spoke to Carrie, and at one point he just kind of looked her in the eye and said, you see these eyes? These are my sister's eyes, too. You look at me and tell me you didn't kill her. And Carrie said, I swear to God I didn't hurt her. I didn't kill her. My gut feeling was telling me that she didn't do it.
Later that day, detectives receive an unexpected call that puts Devin's alleged lover, Michelle Hetzel, back in the spotlight.
We get some information by an individual by the name of George Vine, who goes on to tell us that he knows Michelle and Devin.
He was a friend of theirs, and they took an affinity to going over to his place and hanging out. I think that they would have alcohol there.
According to George, Michelle had recently made an alarming proposition.
He made allegations that Michelle offered him money and sex to kill Devin.
We asked George why he didn't, talk to us sooner about this, and he tells us that, he didn't really believe that she was sincere, that he thought she was just drunk and just talking, until Devin's found at the Canal Museum.
On June 21st, 6 days after Devin was found murdered, detectives set up surveillance outside Michelle Hetzel's home, where she lives with her husband, Brandon Bloss.
We wanted physical evidence, and so we're watching these people now, and watching them take the trash out one day.
Once somebody's garbage can is put out where it's available to the public, we can seize that trash without a search warrant.
Well, this detective did. He did what was known as a garbage pull. What he found in the garbage was gauze pads that had been used over a wound. And even to the normal person looking at it, it looked like a bite mark.
So we apply for a search warrant to search Brandon and Michelle's house. The search warrant's granted. We execute the search warrant.
Inside the house, there was a washer, that there was some clothes and that were still wet.
We find a pair of jeans inside the washing machine. I believe had some blood. During the examination of the jeans that was seized from Michelle and Brandon's house, we found a needle cap inside the one pants pocket.
There was a needle cap that was consistent with the syringe that was found on the body of the victim.
So now we're starting to doubt not only some of the things that Michelle's told us, almost everything that Michelle told us.
Coming up, as the investigation shifts, forensic evidence solidifies the case against a surprising suspect.
He told us that it was a human bite mark. We exhumed her body and did a casting of her teeth.
And authorities pinpoint the motive.
They both cooperated and conspired together to kill this poor young girl.
I guess love does crazy things to you.
Just days after Devin Guzman was found brutally murdered, detectives have discovered possible evidence connecting her close friend and alleged married lover, Michelle Hetzel, to Devin's murder.
In the house, I didn't recover those jeans, and that's when the cap to the syringe was found. That was only a small piece, but it helped put the whole puzzle together.
We also found some blood residue in the backyard.
There was blood on a hose, which suggests that maybe blood is being washed away, as a result of a crime. So this is all circumstantial evidence that a crime may have been committed at this location.
As a forensic team continues their work, detectives speak with neighbors of Michelle Hetzel and Brandon Bloss.
And that's when we came up with a witness, Joe Welsh, who lived across the street.
They seemed like a nice young couple. Michelle was fairly outgoing and would wave to our two little sons at the time. Brandon seemed more reserved, just typical neighbors across the street. As we got later into the spring and into the summer, there seemed to be much more tension between Brandon and Michelle. There were several particularly explosive incidents getting into the early June timeframe. There always seemed to be an argument about this one person who I now know was Devin Guzman.
And he explains to us that he hears a pretty graphic and heated argument at Brandon and Michelle's house the night that Devin went missing. Michelle
Came home and Brandon was shouting from inside the house, just berating her. And Michelle got down on the sidewalk in almost a prayer stance and started shouting, "What the F do you want from me? What the F do you want from me?"
Joe tells detectives that the couple eventually returned inside.
12:35 that morning, I was awoken by a disturbance, shouting. And I looked out, and it was one woman with her back to me, and then two people inside the house, basically telling her that she couldn't be in the house. And I then saw the woman that I now know to be Devin slam her fist on the hood of the car. And she got in her car and she left.
Joe Welsh tells us at some point a little later that he sees Devin's car come back.
Joe Welsh was an important witness because he was able to verify that Devin had been there and left and then came back again, which was consistent with Carrie Renner's story. And according to Hetzel, that never occurred.
So we knew right away. Michelle lied through her teeth about that.
With the couple's home being the possible crime scene, detectives focus on Brandon to find out what he knows.
So we're aware that Brandon is involved in this argument with Michelle, with Devin. So we asked Brandon to come in for an interview. Brandon was a very quiet individual. He appeared very intelligent, no criminal history.
He was a college-educated person. He had a degree in chemistry, so he was a very bright guy. He met Michelle when they were very young, fell in love with Michelle, and ends up marrying Michelle.
Detectives confront Brandon about his wife's on-again, off-again affair with Devin, and he admits that it had made him uncomfortable.
Michelle took Devin to the Virgin Islands and used Brandon's credit card. So, Brandon's very, very upset and very angry about this.
But he said that he had faith that Michelle was going to change and be a real wife to him.
Brandon maintains that neither he nor Michelle had anything to do with Devin's murder.
Eventually, then, we get search warrants to get DNA and photograph Brandon.
He's forced to show us his arms, and when he does, very visible bite marks on his arm. He said that there was some kind of fight going on between Michelle and Devin, and he tried to break it up and got bit.
We didn't really believe Brandon. At the time of Brandon's interview, we did not have enough to charge anyone, so he was allowed to leave.
So Brandon and Michelle's car is impounded. It's made part of the crime scene. It's photographed, and ultimately a search warrant is issued in order to find out if there's any evidence that might be helpful in the case.
Inside the trunk, we find a bloody sweatshirt. It's an XL. We find men's sneakers that have blood on them.
They were sent away to the State Police Crime Lab.
At this point, the evidence is really piling up, so we are fairly sure that Brandon now is involved in this. We asked odontologists to look at the injury to Brandon's arm, and he told us that he believed that it was a human bite mark. We believed that it was Devin that bit him.
But we had to take a bite mark impression from Devin's teeth to be 100% sure.
Unfortunately, she had been buried by that time. We applied for a court order to exhume her body.
I believe the family, was very upset about it, but they understood the need for it.
We exhumed her body and did a casting of her teeth. The casting of her teeth, along with the detailed photographs that were taken from Brandon's arm, were sent to a forensic odontologist.
It was nearly a perfect match.
Brandon is right-handed. If he came up from behind her and put her in like a chokehold position, it would have been in the spot where she would have bit him. The bite mark to Brandon's arm would suggest that Devin put up a fight.
Then the question was, well, was Michelle just a witness to Brandon killing her, or did she help?
Authorities have discovered evidence that connects 25-year-old Brandon Bloss to the murder of Devin Guzman. Detectives suspect that Brandon's wife, Michelle Hetzel, also played a role.
So we believe that Michelle's involved because somebody had to drive Devin's car to the Canal Museum and then pick somebody up. So it would suggest that two people were involved.
and Michelle lied about lots of things in terms of this whole case. Plus, the fact that she tried to hire a hitman just a short time prior to that showed a motive to want to kill Devin.
In August of 2000, nearly 2 months after the murder, authorities received promising results from the crime lab.
We eventually received the report on the DNA from the blood on the clothing that we found in their car, and it was confirmed that it was Devin's blood. During the examination of the jeans that was seized from Michelle and Brandon's washing machine, the blood was diluted to the point where they could not do any more processing with that.
The forensic report officially clears Devin's girlfriend, Carrie Renner, as a suspect.
The blood that was found in Carrie and Devin's shower, it turned out that it was not Devin's.
It was determined not to be relevant. We now have a puzzle that is being put together by circumstantial evidence. The victims bit this man. We have statements, by George Vine that Michelle was trying to do harm to the victim. And we have motive that Brandon Bloss wasn't happy with what was going on with Devin and his wife.
Michelle was definitely obsessed with Devin. She would get very upset and angry when Devin would bounce back and forth between her and Carrie. We believe that Devin probably told her that, look, we're done. I'm going to go with Carrie. And Michelle being angry, saying, if I can't have her, no one's going to have her. And probably went to Brandon and said, look, if you help me do this, this will save our marriage. So that's what we think the motive was. My theory is that they lured Devin over there with the intent to kill her. That Brandon probably came up behind her, put his arm around her neck, start to choke her out, slit her throat. Then they both carried her out back, put her in a car, drove down to the Canal Museum, which was a short distance away from their house, set up the crime scene, and then come back and make up this story as they didn't see her, and then go from there. We never found the murder weapon.
The murder weapon, the knife, could have been dumped in the water. The current can be pretty strong in the waters in that location.
Nearly 1 month after Devin Guzman was murdered, authorities issue arrest warrants for Michelle Hetzel and Brandon Bloss.
They were charged with criminal homicide and criminal conspiracy to commit homicide, and we took them into custody.
When I found out that they were arrested, I'm not really sure how I felt. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel content.
She didn't like Carrie and Devin being happy, so she would always cause a ruckus and chaos. But I never thought she'd go that far, of course. No one ever thought she'd go that far, is to, kill my daughter.
Michelle and Brandon refused to talk, so we could not interview them.
Prosecutors decide to try the couple together. Opening arguments get underway on September 25th, 2001.
We felt we had a strong case, but it wasn't a slam dunk. We had no confessions. It was not going to be easy. And we argued to the jury that both cooperated and conspired together to kill this poor young girl and then plant her body down at the Canal Museum.
Prosecutors argue Michelle's jealousy, combined with Brandon's fear of losing his wife, culminated in murder.
I think that Brandon just had enough of Devin Guzman's involvement with Michelle. I think that he was tired of her. I think that, he was ruining his marriage, his life.
Brandon was just madly in love with her, and he was tired of her always leaving to go to Devin. Michelle was always manipulative. She convinced him, if you just get rid of Devin, she's the issue, then we can be happy. I don't know, I guess love does crazy things to you.
This was a love triangle with a fatal ending.
There's no question that Michelle Hetzel manipulates people. She's a pathological liar.
Michelle and Brandon at the trial, they just sat there. They had no emotion. And they were pointing the finger at each other. So they blamed each other for it.
On October 4th, 2001, the jury deliberates the couple's fate. Just after midnight, they reach a verdict.
The verdict was guilty of homicide, first-degree murder.
My whole family was grateful that they convicted both of them, and it was a feeling of relief.
This crime was a tragedy for the community. Devin was well-loved by a lot of people.
They say time gets easier, and sometimes it doesn't. Even to this day, 24 years later, it still seems like it was yesterday.
This whole thing ruined many, many lives. It changed my life. I have amazing kids, an amazing career in the Army, and some days it's hard to be happy. And I believe that's because, I've only ever really loved Devin. And I still keep her presence strong in my everyday life.
On December 10th, 2002, police officers arrived at a secluded property in the small village of Wustfeld, near Rotenburg, in the German state of Hessen. At first glance, there was nothing particularly remarkable about the house. It stood quietly in the countryside, removed from the noise and movement of the larger cities. The surrounding landscape reflected the calm rhythm of rural Germany, fields stretching into the distance, narrow roads connecting scattered homes, and a silence that could easily make a visitor believe that nothing unusual had ever happened there. Yet investigators had not traveled to this remote location by accident. For weeks, authorities had been examining disturbing information connected to online activity. A report had reached them from an Austrian student who had encountered a series of messages on the internet. The content was so unusual, so disturbing, that it seemed almost impossible to take seriously at first. Yet the more investigators looked into it, the more concerned they became. What initially appeared to be the fantasy of an anonymous internet user slowly began to resemble something far more alarming. By the time officers approached the property that winter day, they were searching for evidence of a crime unlike any they had encountered before. When police entered the residence, they discovered something that would soon make headlines around the world. Inside the house were human remains. Investigators found body parts stored in a freezer. They found bones and other remains hidden around the property. They recovered electronic communications documenting extensive discussions between two men. Most significantly, they discovered a videotape, approximately 4 hours long. That recording would eventually become one of the most important pieces of evidence in modern German criminal history. As investigators began examining the material, an extraordinary and deeply unsettling story emerged. A man had been killed. After his death, parts of his body had been consumed. The person responsible did not deny what had happened. In fact, he openly admitted it. Yet this was not a straightforward murder investigation. The evidence revealed something that complicated every assumption investigators, prosecutors, and eventually judges might have made. The victim appeared to have willingly participated in the events leading to his own death. Emails suggested detailed planning. The videotape appeared to document the encounter itself. There was no indication of a struggle in the conventional sense. Instead, authorities found themselves confronting a case that seemed to challenge fundamental ideas about crime: consent, responsibility, and the limits of personal autonomy. The suspect was a man named Armin Mewes. Within months, his name would become known throughout Germany and far beyond its borders. Media organizations around the world would report on the case. Legal scholars would debate its implications. Psychologists would analyze its disturbing dynamics. Journalists would attempt to explain how such an event could occur in modern society. Yet, despite the sensational headlines that would follow, the deeper story was far more complex than many people initially understood. At its center was not only a man who admitted to killing another human being. At its center was also a victim named Bernd Jürgen Brandes. And surrounding both men was a series of questions that German law had never been forced to answer. Under circumstances quite like these, can a person legally agree to be killed? If someone willingly participates in the events that lead to their own death, does that change the nature of the crime? Does consent eliminate criminal responsibility? Or are there limits beyond which consent simply cannot extend? Those questions would eventually dominate courtrooms, newspaper editorials, television discussions, and academic debates. But before Germany could wrestle with those legal and ethical dilemmas, investigators first had to understand exactly what had happened. The story that emerged was unlike anything most people had ever encountered. It began years before police arrived at that isolated property, long before the discovery of human remains, long before the videotape, long before international headlines transformed the case into one of the most infamous criminal investigations in modern German history. To understand how events reached that point, investigators would need to examine the life of the man at the center of the case. Armin Meiwes was not the kind of person who immediately attracted attention. Those who knew him often described him as polite, quiet, reserved. He had served in the German military from 1981 until 1993. Afterward, he worked as a computer technician. He lived a largely solitary life in a large rural house near Rotenburg. To neighbors and acquaintances, he did not appear dangerous. There were no obvious signs that would lead people to suspect that he would one day become associated with one of the most shocking criminal cases Germany had ever seen. Yet according to statements Meiwes would later make, he had carried unusual fantasies for much of his life. He spoke of a childhood desire to have a younger brother who would remain with him forever. Over time, that desire evolved into something far darker. According to his own account, he developed the belief that consuming another person would allow that individual to become part of him permanently, whether viewed through a psychological, criminal, or social lens. The progression was deeply disturbing. For years, those fantasies remained exactly that, fantasies. But the arrival of the internet created opportunities that had never existed before. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, online communities allowed people with highly unusual interests to communicate with one another across vast distances. Hidden behind usernames and computer screens, individuals could discuss ideas and desires that they would never reveal in ordinary social settings. It was within these online spaces that Armin Meiwes began searching for something specific. He posted advertisements seeking a willing participant. According to later reports, the message was direct and shocking. He was looking for a healthy adult man willing to be killed and eaten. For many people reading such a statement, the obvious assumption would be that it could not possibly be serious. Surely it was a fantasy, a joke, a provocation, something designed merely to shock. Yet the responses began arriving. According to Meiwes, hundreds of individuals replied. Some may have been curious. Some may have been exploring fantasies. Others may never have intended to follow through. Whatever their motivations, conversations took place. Potential meetings were discussed. Plans were considered. Most of those interactions ended before becoming reality. People changed their minds. Communication stopped. Meetings never occurred. The line between fantasy and action remained intact, until one person did not walk away. One person continued the conversation. One person ultimately agreed to meet. His name was Bernd Jürgen Brandes. He was a 43-year-old engineer from Berlin. Investigators would later determine that Brandes possessed his own extreme fantasies involving death and cannibalism. Through emails and discussions, he and Mae West communicated extensively. They discussed what would happen. They planned details. They exchanged messages that would later become crucial evidence. Eventually, they agreed on a date. March 9th, 2001. That decision would change both of their lives forever. For Bernd Brandes, it would be the final day of his life. For Armin Mae West, it would begin a chain of events leading to international notoriety, criminal prosecution, and a life sentence. For Germany, it would trigger one of the most difficult legal debates in recent history. And for investigators standing inside that quiet house in December 2002, it would mark the beginning of a case that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Because as shocking as the discovery of human remains had been, the evidence they recovered suggested that the most difficult questions were still ahead. The physical evidence could establish what happened. The videotape could document the events. The emails could reveal planning and intent. But none of those things provided a simple answer to the question that would eventually dominate the entire case. What happens when a homicide appears to involve the cooperation of the victim? In most murder investigations, the roles are clear. There is a victim. There is an offender. There is violence imposed upon an unwilling person. The Rotenberg case appeared different. Not because a death had not occurred. Not because a crime had not been committed, but because the evidence seemed to show a level of participation that challenged traditional legal categories. As Germany would soon discover, determining what happened inside that isolated house was only the beginning. Understanding how the law should respond would prove even more difficult. And at the center of it all remained the memory of Bernd Brandes, a man whose death would become the subject of global fascination, legal controversy, and endless debate, ensuring that the events of March 2001 would never be forgotten. Long before police officers entered the house in Westfeld, long before investigators reviewed emails, examined physical evidence, or watched the videotape that would later become central to the case, there were two men living separate lives in different parts of Germany. Their paths had never crossed. Their personal histories were different. Their daily routines were different. Yet over time, circumstances would bring them together in a way that would ultimately produce one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern German history. To understand how that happened, it is necessary to look first at the individuals themselves, beginning with the man whose name would become permanently linked to the events that unfolded in March 2001. Armin Mae West. Armin Mae West was born in 1961 in Essen, Germany. Compared to the shocking details that would later dominate international headlines, the known facts of his early life appear almost ordinary. As an adult, he served in the German military from 1981 until 1993. After completing his military service, he worked as a computer technician. On paper, there was little that distinguished him from countless other German citizens living relatively quiet lives. He was employed. He had military experience. He lived independently. Nothing in those basic facts hinted at the extraordinary criminal case that would later unfold. People who knew him often described him in remarkably similar ways. He was quiet. He was polite. He was reserved. He did not stand out in social settings. He was not widely known for aggressive behavior or public disturbances. In many respects, he appeared to be exactly the kind of individual who could spend years living among neighbors without attracting significant attention. Yet appearances can conceal private worlds that remain invisible to everyone else. In later statements, Mae West described thoughts and fantasies that had existed long before investigators ever learned his name. According to his own account, those ideas began during childhood. He spoke about a desire to have a younger brother, not simply a sibling, but someone who would remain with him permanently, someone who would never leave, someone who would always belong. As the years passed, that desire reportedly evolved into something darker and increasingly disturbing. According to Mae West, he began connecting the idea of permanent companionship with fantasies involving cannibalism. He later claimed that he believed consuming another person would allow that individual to become a permanent part of himself. The fantasy was not simply about violence. According to his own explanations, it was connected to possession, permanence, and an inability to accept separation. These statements would later become important because they offered investigators and psychologists insight into how Mae West understood his own actions. They did not excuse what happened. They did not justify it. But they helped explain how a fantasy that seemed impossible to most people could gradually become an obsession. For years, however, those thoughts remained private. There is no indication in the information available that he acted on them during much of his adult life. Instead, the fantasies existed largely in isolation, hidden behind an outwardly ordinary existence. That isolation became an important part of the story. Mae West lived in a large rural house near Rothenburg, surrounded by the quiet landscape of the German countryside. Unlike the crowded environments of major cities, rural life often offers privacy and distance. For many people, such settings are peaceful. For others, they can deepen feelings of solitude. Investigators would later view this environment as part of the broader context surrounding the case. The house itself would eventually become one of the most infamous crime scenes in Germany. But before that happened, it was simply the place where Mae West spent much of his life alone with thoughts that few people around him understood. If Armin Mae West represented one side of the story, Bernd Jürgen Brandes represented the other. Yet despite the enormous attention given to the offender over the years, it is important to remember that the case ultimately centers on the death of a real human being. Bernd Brandes was 43 years old. He worked as an engineer and lived in Berlin. Much of the public discussion surrounding the case would later focus on the unusual circumstances of his death. But reducing him solely to those circumstances risks overlooking a basic truth. Before becoming known as a victim in one of Germany's most notorious criminal cases, Brandes was a person with a life, a career, and a personal history. The available information indicates that investigators later learned Brandes possessed extreme fantasies involving being killed and consumed. This fact would become enormously important during the legal proceedings because it helped explain why communication between him and Mae West developed the way it did. It also contributed to the central legal dilemma that would eventually dominate the trials. However, understanding that aspect of the case requires careful distinction. The existence of those fantasies did not eliminate the reality of his death, nor did it remove the responsibility of the person who ultimately killed him. Instead, it created a complicated and deeply uncomfortable situation in which investigators had to determine how the law should interpret actions that appeared to involve both planning and participation from the victim himself. Before the two men ever met, they existed in separate worlds. Mae West lived in rural Hessen. Brandes lived in Berlin. There was no obvious reason their lives should intersect. The connection emerged through a force that was transforming society at the turn of the millennium: the Internet. By the late 1990s, online communication had begun creating opportunities for people to connect across geographical boundaries in ways that had never before been possible. Communities formed around hobbies, professions, interests, and ideas. Most of these interactions were harmless. People exchanged information, built friendships, and discovered others who shared their passions. But the Internet also provided spaces where individuals could discuss far more unusual interests, away from public scrutiny. Within some of these online forums, Participants explored extreme fantasies that would rarely be discussed openly in everyday life. According to later reports, Armin Maywes became active in several online communities focused on highly unconventional sexual interests. It was there that he decided to move beyond fantasy and begin searching for someone willing to participate in the scenario he had imagined for years. The advertisement he posted was shocking in its directness. He sought a healthy adult male who was willing to be killed and eaten. For most people encountering such a statement, disbelief would be the natural reaction. The idea seemed so extreme that many would assume it was not genuine. Yet according to Mew's later statements, he received more than 400 responses. That number remains one of the most startling details in the entire case. It revealed that even an advertisement describing such an extraordinary and disturbing request could attract attention in the anonymous environment of the internet. Not every response represented genuine intent. Some individuals may have been curious. Others may have been exploring fantasies without any desire to act on them. According to the information available, numerous potential meetings never occurred because participants changed their minds before anything happened. Again and again, the boundary between fantasy and reality held. People withdrew. Plans collapsed. Conversations ended. But eventually one person continued the discussion. That person was Baron Brandis. Through emails and online communication, Brandis and Maywes began corresponding. The exchanges became increasingly detailed. Investigators later determined that the two men discussed what would happen if they met. They communicated extensively. They explored expectations. They talked through plans. The significance of those emails cannot be overstated. They would later become crucial evidence because they documented the existence of communication. Before the crime occurred, they established that the meeting was not spontaneous. It was not accidental. It was arranged through deliberate and repeated contact between two individuals who had spent time discussing the events that would eventually unfold. As investigators later reviewed the communications, a picture began to emerge of two men moving steadily toward a decision that neither ultimately abandoned. Many others had backed away. Many others had chosen not to proceed. Yet for reasons known only to them, Maywes and Brandis continued forward. The conversations culminated in an agreement. A date was chosen, March 9th, 2001. A location was established. The meeting would take place at Mew's home in Wustfeld. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, that moment stands as one of the most consequential decisions in the entire story. Once the date was set, years of fantasy, isolation, online communication, and mutual planning began moving toward reality. Neither investigators nor the public would know any of this at the time. The world continued as normal. The rural house near Rothenburg remained quiet. Berlin remained hundreds of kilometers away. The internet conversations remained hidden from public view. Yet events had already been set in motion. The story that would eventually captivate international audiences was no longer a hypothetical discussion taking place behind computer screens. It was becoming real. And on March 9th, 2001, two men would finally meet face to face. What happened next would become the defining incident of the case and the foundation of one of the most difficult legal and ethical debates Germany had ever faced. On March 9th, 2001, the events that had been discussed for weeks through emails and online exchanges finally moved out of the digital world and into physical reality. When Baron Jürgen Brandis arrived at the home of Armin Maywes in the quiet village of Wustfeld, a moment that would later be described in court records as the turning point where planning ended and irreversible action began. And according to investigative findings and Mew's own later statements, the encounter did not begin with violence or chaos, but with an unsettling sense of coordination, as if both men were following a sequence that had already been agreed upon in advance. And one of the most significant early elements documented by investigators was the presence of a video recording device that captured the entire sequence of events over approximately 4 hours. A recording that would later become central evidence in court, but whose full content was never publicly released due to its disturbing nature. And as the interaction unfolded, alcohol was consumed by both individuals, while Brandis also took sleeping medication and painkillers as part of what had been discussed beforehand in their communications. And this detail would later be emphasized in legal proceedings as part of understanding the state in which he was during the early phase of the encounter. And what followed, according to the case file and Muse admissions, involved actions that were explicitly requested by Brandis himself, including the severing of his genitalia, an act that was attempted within the framework of their agreement, and which both men then tried to cook and consume, though the attempt was ultimately unsuccessful. And this moment marked a deeply disturbing escalation from discussion into irreversible physical consequences, after which Brandis suffered significant blood loss and remained in a bathtub for an extended period of time, during which his condition deteriorated severely. While Mae West later stated in court that he hesitated for a considerable time before taking the final step, a detail that became part of the psychological and legal interpretation of his intent. And as the situation worsened, the decisive act occurred when Mae West ultimately killed Brandis by cutting his throat, an action that transformed the case from a consensual encounter gone catastrophically wrong into a homicide under German law, regardless of the earlier discussions or alleged consent, and following the death. The recording continued to document the aftermath, capturing the transition from the final moments of life to silence, a fact that would later weigh heavily in both legal arguments and public perception of the case, because it provided a continuous record that removed ambiguity about the sequence of events, even if it did not resolve the moral and legal questions surrounding them. And after Brandis' death, Mae West proceeded to dismember the body, an act later confirmed through investigative evidence. And he then treated the remains in a manner that further intensified the gravity of the case, including hanging the body parts using hooks similar to those used in a slaughterhouse, a detail that investigators noted as part of the methodical nature of what followed. And the remains were divided and stored, with portions placed in a freezer for later use, while other parts were disposed of or concealed around the surrounding property, creating a fragmented crime scene that would only later be fully reconstructed by authorities. And over the months that followed, Mae West consumed portions of the remains, with investigators estimating that approximately 20 kilograms of human flesh were eaten over time, a fact that became one of the most widely reported and disturbing aspects of the case, not only because of its nature, but because of the extended duration over which it occurred, transforming what had begun as a single fatal encounter into an ongoing post-crime behavior that continued long after the death of the victim. And during this period, Mae West did not immediately attempt to conceal all evidence in a traditional sense, but rather maintained a level of documentation and retention that would later assist investigators in reconstructing the events, including electronic communications and physical remains that remained at the property. And as time passed, the case would eventually move toward discovery, not because of immediate suspicion, but because of continued online activity, as Mae West reportedly continued to engage in internet forums and even posted further advertisements seeking additional participants, a decision that would ultimately lead to exposure, since one of these posts was identified by an Austrian student who found the content disturbing enough to report it to authorities, triggering a chain of investigation that would culminate in police surveillance and eventual action. But at the time of the incident itself, none of these future consequences were visible, and the immediate reality inside the house remained confined to the two individuals and the recording that captured their interaction. And what makes the case particularly complex in retrospective legal analysis is that the actions were not presented by investigators as a sudden explosion of violence, but rather as a sequence of agreed-upon steps that escalated beyond any point where reversal was possible. And yet, regardless of prior communication, the law would later treat the final outcome as homicide, because consent in such circumstances could not override the legal protections afforded to human life. And thus the incident stands not only as a record of what occurred inside a single rural home, but also as the foundation of a broader legal and ethical debate that would soon extend far beyond the individuals involved, reaching courts, scholars, and the public in ways that few criminal cases ever do. And by the time the sequence of events concluded, the man who had arrived willingly at the house in Wustfeld was dead. The man who had recorded the encounter was left alone with the aftermath. And a case had been set in motion that would eventually force an entire legal system to confront questions it had never before been required to answer in such a direct and unsettling form. The investigation into the events surrounding the death of Baron Jürgen Brandes did not begin immediately with clarity or certainty, but rather with fragmented digital traces and a report that initially seemed too disturbing to be taken at face value. As German authorities were first alerted not through a conventional missing person report tied directly to Armin Meiwes, but through online activity that had drawn the attention of an Austrian student who encountered unusual and alarming messages circulating on internet forums. Messages that referenced extreme acts involving consent, death, and cannibalism. And while such claims might have been dismissed as fictional or exaggerated in isolation, the consistency and specificity of the content prompted the student to report them to authorities, setting in motion a preliminary investigative process that would soon expand far beyond what anyone initially expected. And as investigators began to examine the digital footprint associated with these communications, they gradually identified a pattern of postings linked to an individual operating under online anonymity, yet repeatedly returning to similar themes involving arranged meetings and explicit descriptions of acts that, if real, would constitute severe criminal offenses under German law. And at this early stage, investigators faced a significant challenge because the internet allowed individuals to construct identities that were difficult to verify without physical evidence, meaning that every claim had to be carefully corroborated before action could be taken. But as more data was gathered, the seriousness of the situation became increasingly difficult to ignore, particularly as investigators traced connections between online messages and a physical location in rural Hessen. And this link ultimately led them toward the name Armin Meiwes, a man whose digital activity appeared to align with the disturbing content that had been reported. And as surveillance and deeper analysis of his communications progressed, authorities began to build a preliminary case that suggested not only abstract fantasy discussions, but the possibility that a real crime had occurred, involving real individuals in a real location, and with potentially irreversible consequences. And this suspicion was further strengthened when investigators discovered that Meiwes had continued posting online even after the suspected time frame of the initial incident, indicating that whatever had occurred had not ended his engagement with these forums, but rather had continued in parallel with attempts to seek further contact with similar individuals, a fact that would later become significant in establishing behavioral patterns. And as the investigation intensified, authorities prepared to move from digital observation to physical intervention, culminating in the decision to search his residence, a step that required careful coordination due to the uncertainty surrounding what might be found inside the property, including the possibility of hazardous conditions or further victims. And on December 10, 2002, German police executed a raid on Mew's home in Wustfeld, entering the rural property that had already been identified through digital tracking and investigative leads. And what they discovered inside immediately confirmed that the case was far more serious than initial online reports had suggested, as officers located human remains stored in a freezer, along with additional bones and body parts that had been concealed around the property, indicating deliberate attempts at preservation and concealment over an extended period. And alongside the physical evidence, investigators recovered a series of electronic communications between Mae West and Brandis, including emails that documented detailed discussions prior to the meeting in March 2001, providing crucial context for understanding how the two men had established contact and arranged the encounter. And perhaps most significantly, officers also recovered a videotape approximately 4 hours in length that appeared to document the entire sequence of events between Mae West and Brandis, a piece of evidence that would later become central in both legal proceedings and public understanding of the case, though its full contents were never publicly released due to their disturbing nature. And as investigators processed the scene, the combination of physical remains, digital communications, and recorded footage created a comprehensive evidentiary framework that left little doubt that a death had occurred under circumstances requiring immediate criminal investigation. And when confronted with the evidence, Armin Mae West did not initially resist the findings or deny involvement, but instead provided a near-immediate confession, acknowledging his role in the events that had taken place. A confession that aligned closely with the physical and digital evidence recovered from the property. And this convergence of sources, testimony, material remains, and recorded documentation allowed investigators to reconstruct the timeline of events with unusual clarity compared to many other homicide cases. Yet despite this clarity regarding what had happened, the legal interpretation of those events remained deeply complex, because the evidence also indicated that Baron Brandis had actively participated in the planning process and had consented to aspects of the encounter prior to his death, raising immediate questions about how responsibility should be assigned under German criminal law, and whether consent could alter the classification of homicide in a case involving deliberate killing. And as the investigation transitioned into formal prosecution, authorities were faced not only with assembling evidence, but with anticipating legal arguments that would challenge fundamental assumptions about intent, autonomy, and criminal liability. And within this context, the videotape became particularly significant, not because it was publicly released, but because it provided investigators and later the court with a continuous, unbroken record of the interaction between the two men, eliminating ambiguity about sequence while simultaneously intensifying the ethical and legal difficulty of interpreting what had occurred, since it documented not only the final outcome, but also the interactions leading up to it. And as prosecutors prepared their case, they were required to balance the existence of apparent consent with the legal obligation to determine whether the actions still constituted murder under statutory definitions. And this tension would become the defining issue as the case moved toward trial, transforming what might have been a straightforward homicide investigation into one of the most legally contested criminal cases in modern German history. And in the background of all these developments remained the physical reality of the evidence recovered from the property. Human remains stored, hidden, and partially consumed over time, alongside digital records that showed communication stretching back before the incident itself. And by the time Mae West was formally taken into custody, the investigation had already moved beyond the question of identifying a suspect and into the far more difficult task of determining how the law should respond to a case where the boundaries between victim participation and criminal responsibility appeared fundamentally blurred, setting the stage for a courtroom battle that would soon divide legal opinion and capture international attention. When Armin Mae West was brought before the German court system, The case no longer belonged solely to the realm of criminal investigation, but had entered a legal space where evidence, ethics, and statutory interpretation collided in ways that tested the limits of existing law. And from the outset, it was clear that the central issue would not be whether Mae West had killed Bernd Brandes, because the physical evidence, the digital communications, the videotape, and his own confession all confirmed that a death had occurred and that he had been directly responsible for it, but rather how that killing should be legally classified under German criminal law, given the unusual and deeply controversial context in which it took place, particularly the question of consent, which would become the most contested element of the entire trial, as defense arguments emphasized that Brandes had not only agreed to meet Mae West, but had also actively participated in planning the events that led to his death, including explicit discussions documented in email exchanges that were later presented as evidence in court. And these communications suggested a level of foreknowledge and cooperation that complicated the traditional legal narrative of perpetrator and victim, while prosecutors, on the other hand, maintained that regardless of any prior agreement or willingness expressed by Brandes, the act of killing another human being remained unlawful under German law and could not be justified by consent alone, particularly where the circumstances indicated that the actions went beyond a simple assisted death scenario and instead involved deliberate conduct leading to homicide. And as the first trial began in 2004, public attention intensified dramatically, with media outlets across Germany and internationally reporting on a case that had already become infamous due to its unusual facts. And within the courtroom itself, the atmosphere reflected the gravity of the proceedings, as judges were confronted with evidence that included not only testimony and forensic material, but also the videotape documenting the events of March 9th, 2001, a piece of evidence that was acknowledged as crucial to understanding the sequence of actions, but which was also so disturbing in content that it was not made publicly available in full. And during the proceedings, Mew's own statements played a central role, as he admitted to the killing and did not deny the core facts of the prosecution's case, instead providing explanations that focused on his perception of mutual agreement and the psychological motivations he claimed to have held, including his belief that he was fulfilling a long-standing fantasy related to possession and permanence. While the court was also required to consider the condition and intentions of Bernd Brandes, whose participation in the planning process introduced a level of complexity rarely encountered in homicide cases. And this duality between consent and criminal liability became the defining legal tension of the trial, ultimately leading the court in the first instance to classify the offense not as murder but as manslaughter, or in German legal terms a lesser form of homicide, resulting in a sentence of 8.5 years imprisonment, a decision that immediately sparked widespread controversy and public debate, as many observers questioned how a case involving deliberate killing and dismemberment could result in what was perceived by some as a relatively limited sentence, while others argued that the legal system had appropriately accounted for the unique circumstances surrounding consent and participation. And this division of opinion reflected a broader societal discomfort with the implications of the verdict, because it appeared to challenge deeply held assumptions about the inviolability of human life and the extent to which individuals can legally consent to their own death. And as the public reaction intensified, prosecutors chose to appeal the decision, arguing that the initial classification did not adequately reflect the nature of the crime or the intent behind it. And in 2005, the Federal Court of Justice intervened, ordering a retrial on the basis that the original judgment required reassessment, particularly in light of arguments that Mew's actions were driven not merely by mutual agreement, but by underlying motives that could be interpreted as sexual gratification, a factor that, if established, would significantly alter the legal interpretation of intent and severity. And during the retrial process in 2006, expert psychological evaluations were presented to the court, with specialists assessing Mew's mental state and his ongoing fantasies. And according to these assessments, he continued to exhibit persistent cannibalistic ideation, a finding that prosecutors used to support the argument that his actions were not solely the result of an agreed arrangement, but were instead rooted in personal gratification and compulsive fantasy fulfillment. While the existence of the videotape again played a crucial evidentiary role, as it demonstrated the structured and deliberate nature of the encounter, undermining the argument that the events could be viewed purely as a consensual assisted act. And as the court examined the totality of evidence during the retrial, it ultimately reached a different conclusion from the first trial, determining that the legal threshold for murder had been met, and that the presence of prior agreement did not negate the criminal responsibility associated with the intentional killing of another person under German law, particularly given the nature of the act and the interpretation of intent presented by the prosecution. And as a result, Armin Meiwes was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, a ruling that effectively replaced the earlier manslaughter conviction and established a definitive legal position on the case within the German judicial system, while also signaling that consent, in circumstances involving intentional killing, could not override the protections afforded by criminal law. And this final verdict became the authoritative resolution of the case, even though public and academic debate continued long after the trial concluded, because the implications of the judgment extended beyond Meiwes himself and into broader discussions about autonomy, legality, and the boundaries of consent in extreme situations and within the courtroom context. The shift from the initial sentence to a life imprisonment conviction illustrated how legal interpretation can evolve when higher courts reassess evidence and intent, especially in cases where psychological factors, recorded documentation, and conflicting interpretations of consent intersect. And by the conclusion of the retrial, the German legal system had not only determined the fate of Armin Meiwes, but had also clarified its position on a fundamental question that had been thrust upon it by an unprecedented set of circumstances, establishing that regardless of prior agreement between individuals, the intentional killing of another person remained subject to the full weight of murder law. And with that decision, the case moved from legal uncertainty into final judgment, even as its broader ethical and societal implications continued to resonate far beyond the courtroom. After the final verdict was delivered and Armin Meiwes was sentenced to life imprisonment, the case did not fade into silence in the way many criminal proceedings eventually do, but instead continued to exist in public discourse, legal analysis, and psychological discussion, because the questions it raised were not confined to a single courtroom or a single moment in time. And at the center of its lasting impact remained the reality that a man had been killed under circumstances involving documented communication, apparent consent, and a level of planning that defied conventional categories of homicide cases. And while the German legal system had ultimately reached a definitive conclusion that the act constituted murder, the broader implications of how such a case should be understood continued to generate debate long after the trial ended, particularly among legal scholars who examined the tension between personal autonomy and the state's obligation to protect life, as well as among psychologists who attempted to understand the development of extreme fantasies that, in this case, transitioned from private thought into real-world action. And within the prison system, Meiwes began serving his life sentence, with reports indicating that he was assigned to work in the prison laundry and participated in certain religious activities, a detail that added another layer of complexity to public perception, as it contrasted sharply with the violent nature of the crime for which he had been convicted. And there were also reports that he had become vegetarian while incarcerated, a fact often noted in media coverage but not central to the legal outcome of the case itself. And over time, Mae West submitted requests for early release, as is possible within the German legal system under specific conditions for life sentences. But these requests were consistently denied, with authorities and psychological evaluators expressing concerns about the potential risk of reoffending and the persistence of underlying fantasies that had been documented during the trial process. And as a result, his imprisonment continued without interruption, reinforcing the finality of the court's judgment while also highlighting the ongoing responsibility of the state to assess risk in cases involving extreme criminal behavior and beyond the individual circumstances of Mew's incarceration. The case itself became a point of reference in academic and legal discussions across Germany and internationally, because it forced legal systems and ethical frameworks to confront a situation in which consent appeared to exist in a context where it traditionally held no legal validity. And this tension became one of the defining aspects of the case's legacy, as scholars debated whether the law should ever recognize consent in cases involving lethal harm, or whether there must always be absolute limits regardless of individual autonomy. And in examining why the case attracted global attention, several factors consistently emerged, beginning with the fact that the victim had apparently participated voluntarily in the events leading to his own death, a circumstance that challenged common assumptions about victimhood and coercion in homicide cases, combined with the existence of a detailed videotape that documented the encounter and provided an unusually direct record of the events in question, as well as the fact that the two individuals had met through the internet, reflecting the growing influence of online communication in facilitating relationships that would otherwise not have been possible, including the consumption of human remains over time, which further distinguished the case from more conventional homicide investigations. And taken together, these elements contributed to the case becoming not only a subject of criminal law, but also a broader cultural reference point for discussions about deviance, consent, and the boundaries of human behavior. And yet, despite the sensational aspects that often dominate public recollection, the case ultimately remains anchored in the death of Baron Jürgen Brandes, whose life ended in a sequence of events that he had discussed and planned with Mae West, but that nonetheless resulted in irreversible loss. And within this reality lies the central tension that continues to define the case's legacy. Because while legal systems can classify actions, assign responsibility, and impose sentences, they cannot fully resolve the ethical discomfort created when a victim's participation complicates the narrative of crime. And as a result, the Rotenberg case continues to be studied not only as a criminal matter, but also as a challenge to legal philosophy and moral reasoning, illustrating how rare and extreme cases can expose the limits of existing frameworks. And even years after the trial, the name Armin Mae West remains associated with one of the most unusual and controversial criminal cases in modern German history, not because it offers simple answers, but because it forces continued engagement with questions that resist easy resolution, particularly those involving autonomy, consent, and the fundamental value placed on human life within legal systems designed to protect it.
जिन जाने गो ना कोई माने करिए रे या जान भी आखिर कमजोर होवे जिन जाने गो ना कोई माने करियो रे या जान भी आखिर कमजोर होवे सदों बादशाही भी कायम नहीं रहती सदों बादशाही रे कायम नहीं रहती नहीं एक दिन गोरे सदों जोरे होवे دنیا دن بدلتی جائے اج عورتیں کل کچھ اور ہووے دنیا دن بدلتی جائے اج عورتیں کل کچھ اور ہووے رائی موت کو ذائقہ کو چکھنو ہے رائی موت کو ذائقہ کو چکھنو ہے پاویں کتنو کوئی شاہ زور ہووے ذوق مورے مگی شوق دل ماں قد نبی گو پاک دربار دیکھو ذوق پورے مگی شوق دل مارے قد نبی گو پاک دربار دیکھو دوست رب گو خاص حبیب پیارو دوست رب گو خاص حبیب پیارو اکھاں نال ہوں ویرے ایک بار دیکھو جاؤں صدقے لکھ آزار واری نالے روزہ گا سونا مینار دیکھو جاؤں صدقے لکھ آزار واری میں نالے روزہ گا سونا مینار دیکھو اللہ دے توفیق اقبال اقبال اللہ دے توفیق اقبال اقبال جگ بنگلا گارے چمکار دیکھو جس واسطے زمین آسمان بنے ہو کیسا نبی کی اونچی شان ہوئی ہے جس واسطے زمین آسمان بنے ہو کیسا نبی کی اونچی شان ہوئی ہے دوست رب کو خاص حبیب پیارو دوست رب کو خاص حبیب پیارو گل بچ قرآن بیان ہوئی ہے رتبہ دتو خدا نے آپ جس نا اوپر نازل کتاب قرآن ہوئی ہے رتبہ دتو خدا نے آپ جس نا اوپر نازل کتاب قرآن ہوئی ہے اقبال امت نارے بخشان بستے اقبال امت نارے او بخشان بستے سونا نبی گے آتے کو مانے ہوئی ہے فضل کرے اللہ پاک جے کرے جا تو پہنچو ہوں سونا دربار آگے فے فضل کرے اللہ پاک جے کرے جا تو پہنچ رہے سونا دربار آگے جا تو پہنچ مدینہ کی گلیاں ماں جا تو پہنچ مدینہ کی گلیاں ماں دکھ دسے تو سب سرکار آگے دس لے توڑے آلے حوالے اپنا سر دکھ درد سارا آزار آگے دو ملے جا تورے اقبال تنا سو دو ملے جا تورے اقبال تنا کھلے جا تورے اسے بازار آگے